Because one of the worst things that can happen is one of the members of your team sort of agrees or gives it away before you even have a chance to say anything. And that happens so often. And you're thinking, what are you doing? And the other side is going to look for those cracks in the system there to see where they can wedge in and get an advantage.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Beth Fisher-Yoshida, CEO at Fisher-Yoshida International LLC, and Rodney Erb, CEO at TruVue Analytics. And we're going to be talking about negotiations today and really highlighting training and educational gaps as well as gaps in data and trying to bring all of that together. Not just the training and the data, but also all the people in the organization so that they're in alignment when you go into these negotiations, because all you got to do is divide and conquer. And all of a sudden, whichever position you have in negotiations, you've lost, your leverage, and you may have lost your ability to get the best possible deal for your healthcare organization.
Yeah, Justin, I'm curious to see what their direction is, their collaborative approach is from Beth's experience, and then also Rodney's experience too on there. Just really the focus on building those triads, building those teams. This is something that has not been reinvented. It's been as old as forever. We've been negotiating and developing conflict resolution in the workplace, and I'm curious to see where they take it. So looking forward to seeing today's podcast.
All right. Well, we're going to be right back with Beth and Rodney after a short break.
I'm Hayes Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Beth Fisher-Yoshida, CEO at Fisher-Yoshida International LLC, and Rodney Erb, CEO at TruVue Analytics. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with the both of you because we're going to be talking about negotiations. And I think a lot of people out there might think that they have mastery over negotiations, but we are going to really get into it related to negotiations and training. And I think that everybody is going to be really impressed with the depth of the conversation. So I want to introduce you both. I'm going to start with you, Beth. If you can just tell the audience a little bit about your background before we get into the interview.
Sure. Thank you, Justin. So in addition to working at Fisher-Yoshida International, I'm also at Columbia University in the city of New York, directing a master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution. I have a background in intercultural communications, having lived in Japan for many years, and I work teaching negotiations to people in organizations in a variety of industries in addition to at school. I think that's what I'll say for now.
Beth, you mentioned you teach at Columbia University. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you're part of the master's program on negotiation and conflict resolution. Can you expand a little bit more on that, please?
Sure. I would say in the 1960s, somebody named Morton Deutsch started the social psychology program at Columbia University. Long story short, in the 1980s, he started a center, and it's really about education, research, and practice related to negotiation and conflict resolution. And we started the master's program in 2008. And people come from a variety of backgrounds and want to do a variety of things, anything from organizational work, leadership, business development, to international relations, mediation, peacekeeping, communities, you name it. Everybody does negotiation at some point in time. And so some people want to have more mastery of it, so to speak.
I think that's great, Beth. I think we have our expert witness in litigation now. So thank you, Beth.
Okay. Yeah.
That's great, Beth. And then Rodney, you and I got introduced through a mutual acquaintance, and he said, "Oh, you've got to talk to Rodney about negotiations. He's got something really cool coming down the pike." And so, I'll kind of leave it there and let you talk about the work that not only you're doing today, but your experience that led you to lead TruVue Analytics.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Thanks for having us today. So, like you, I have my background. I was a registered nurse by training and sort of fell into medical device sales shortly thereafter. And when I went down that path, I worked for a large medical device manufacturer, did it for many years. I thought I knew everything there was about negotiation and thought I was doing all the right things until you sort of realize you don't know what you don't know. And so as time went on, I went from being a sales rep at Medtronic to then becoming a district manager, eventually sort of got to the point where, in my role, given my clinical background, I didn't have enough there from a business standpoint. So I was starting to look at different programs and different ways of sort of tackling the negotiation issues that I was dealing with in my role at the time. And so that's when I actually came across Beth Fisher-Yoshida and the program at Columbia. And that sort of opened up the doors and completely changed my perspective on a lot of things, especially with the given dynamics in healthcare. And, I think overall, when we look at negotiation in this space, there's a lot of people, to your point, I think you said earlier, that do it every day and they think they're doing a great job. But until you really realize all the different key components to negotiation and how important they are, it makes it really challenging, especially in healthcare, given all the dynamics that are out there. And so ultimately what this put me on the path on was developing a software platform and also the company that I'm CEO of now, which is really focused on taking care of some of the aspects of negotiation, which we'll get into, I'm sure, during the rest of this podcast.
Well, let's start by setting the baseline, okay? So many people have a pretty common understanding of negotiations, but let's break it down just a little bit further. That way we can start going into some of the training and educational aspects and really, highlighting, Beth, the work that you're doing and why it is so important and the gaps that Rodney identified just now. So let's just set the table. What is negotiations?
So it's really about, let's say, two or more people want something. They typically have a perception that the other person is getting in their way and they have to win. So they go back and forth in some kind of conversation, I put in air quotes, and that's a negotiation. What a lot of people are missing is that you do not have to accept the way things are framed. You can take control of the process. You can take control of the pacing, the amount of information you share or don't share, and really shifting perspectives by the use of asking some really good questions.
So I'm assuming that negotiations happen in both very formal ways and then also in informal ways. What are some of the differences between the two?
So I think what happens is in a formal negotiation, everybody knows they're coming to the table to negotiate. It's already been established that this is going to be a capital N negotiation. So people prepare, people try to gather information, or let me put it this way, people should prepare and they should gather information, but a lot of times they don't. And there's a perception that the other party is going to try to win one over on you. Very often we have a competitive orientation to it, when in actuality it doesn't have to be. The small end negotiation, or the typical negotiations you do on a daily basis, probably thousands, if not millions of time a day with all different people. You're not prepared for those. You don't even realize they're in negotiation. It could be as simple as, what do you want to eat for dinner tonight, to something more substantial about, should we get married, or something like that. But you're going to negotiate. And so there's a little different attitude, orientation, and preparation with both.
So bringing this back to healthcare and negotiating in our space, Rodney, I want to come back to you because, you had said that you really realized that negotiating was a lot bigger picture than maybe you realized. And so you were seeking out some education and some training on that. What were some gaps? And I'm assuming preparation was a big part of it, right? You can only prepare to the level of knowledge that you have. So what were some gaps that you felt like maybe common for other healthcare executives or on the provider side related to negotiating and specifically around that preparation piece? What are they not preparing for?
Wow, that's a great question, Justin. I think, when I look at what really drew me into the negotiation literature, it's that framing and perspective taking that I think is lacking in a lot of situations when people are doing the prep process in negotiation. More specifically, when we look at the way that most negotiations are approached in healthcare, I think one of the biggest challenges today is that you have these long-standing relationships. These are not relationships that are, fly by night. These are actually established relationships, whether it be the vendor with the physician, the vendor with the hospital administrator. These are the same people they're negotiating with over and over again. And things are sort of changing now because there's more transparency and there's more data out there. But really the way that I still see this practice today is that when vendors are approaching supply chain or physicians, they're negotiating from a stance that it's this transactional relationship, which it's not. It's a long-term relationship, right? So most of the time is spent arguing or bickering over price, and it's really focused on, who can get to the lowest cost as soon as possible. And I think that's a big challenge. And really, when it comes down to the preparation piece, it's understanding from either side what's important to them. But the problem with this type of negotiation is that it's multi-party. It's not just one person negotiating with another person. There's actually a lot of triangulation that occurs as well. So when it comes down to it, you've got the vendor, physician, administrator. And if any one of those parties is not prepared for that negotiation, the entire negotiation can be derailed pretty quickly, right? And if people aren't communicating, they're not on the same page. And if that preparation process is different for each of those parties, or the perspective is different for each of those parties, things can quickly be derailed. So when we look at preparation in this space, there's 4 critical steps that I think are important, right? And, when we talk about preparation is truly 90%, or at least I say in the literature, I don't know, Beth, is it 80%, I guess, but I always say it's 90% to shoot for the highest. But it's 90%. And what does that mean? So in the beginning, it's information gathering, it's goal setting, it's strategic planning, and then there's rehearsal and final prep. And that's part of that 90%. The actual act of negotiating is only 10% of it. And that's the actual interaction with the other individual. So unfortunately, what we see is that most people spend their time in that 10% where it's that act of negotiating, and they're not preparing properly, or they're not doing the right intake in the preparation process, which makes it challenging. And that's why I think a lot of agreements and deals, you can negotiate a great agreement, but at the end of the day, if there's no compliance attached to it and if people aren't following through on it, then you're going to end up losing in the long term. And then that's how trust degrades. And then you've got a whole slew of other issues.
No, appreciate both your comments, Beth and Rodney as well. Talking about that preparation component, 80, 90%, 99% of the solution, it seems to be really engaging the triad of individuals you talked about. But I want you guys to talk a little bit about how things have changed. I remember we used to all sit in a room. We used to have a meeting, whether it was a capital expenditure of $10 million or it was moving forward with a medical device. As Rodney, I've shared some of that space too, so I've been down that road. But how are we communicating now? And is that preparation different by being on what we're on today, being on a Zoom call? We're not seeing each other face to face. We're not picking up that much body language. How much has that changed in the last couple years as opposed to where we really could sit down over a 3-hour dinner or meet at, the facility with the physician administrator and key stakeholders?
I was going to say 2 things. So in addition to going virtual, which we can talk about in a minute, the nature of healthcare in this country has changed a lot over the past couple of years. And so independent doctors or doctors that belong to different groups are now part of larger hospital systems. So what's happened is the roles and responsibilities have shifted, and that means the relationships have shifted, but not all the mindsets and behaviors have shifted accordingly, right? So you have different kinds of turf or different kinds of attitude about territory. What's in my domain? What's in your domain? What do you do? What do I do? And there are a lot of assumptions that are attached to that. So there's an assumption that doctors don't care about price. They only want the product they want, or that doctors have a particular relationship with a vendor and that's the product they're going with. It's what I've always used. I'm going to continue to use it. And that's not completely accurate. So that kind of alignment is what's out of whack a little bit right now.
All right, so let's talk about training and education as it stands today. I can already tell that there's a gap because Rodney had to go look for it, right? So I want to start with accessibility. Like, definitely tell me about the methods, but talk to me about accessibility as well.
There's a ton of negotiation education out there. There are many people that do negotiation training, many organizations. One of the challenges, or let me say two of the challenges, one is that there's not enough time that's spent. So you're not going to go to a half a day or a 1 day workshop in negotiation and become a master of it. That just doesn't happen. You learn the concepts, you learn about the skills, but it doesn't mean you have the skills. And the second part is, even though you're learning about it in a sort of a generic context, you then have to bring it home to your own negotiation. And that's where there's not enough, what I would say, negotiation coaching. It would be great if we could have more negotiation coaching preparing for that particular negotiation, and including having team negotiations. Because one of the worst things that can happen is one of the members of your team sort of agrees or gives it away before you even have a chance to say anything. And that happens so often, and you're thinking, what are you doing? And the other side is going to look for those cracks in the system there to see where they can wedge in and get an advantage.
So you just mentioned something, about building skills and the coaching aspect to really develop those skills. But then there's this whole other side of it, which is, how do we know that those skills were learned properly and effectively? And I can tell you, on one of our other podcasts, we focus on the OR. It's called First Case. Garry's actually been a guest on that podcast, but we talk a lot about certification. And one of the partners around getting, points for certification for perioperative nurses is this entity called the Competency and Credentialing Institute. And they've really been focusing on this competency piece. How do we build certification around competency? And I want to bring that to our conversation. So you have this skill building. You've identified that the coaching piece may be lacking to make sure that those skills get to a level of competency. But then there's the next step, which is, how do we even evaluate the competency?
So there can be formal sorts of evaluations, such as you do a kind of role play, you get observations and you get feedback on it. There could be a checklist about things you're supposed to measure up. Did you identify the needs accurately? Did you take other perspectives? All those kinds of things that you learn in a negotiation process. But at the end of the day, for me, negotiation is about a relationship. What's my relationship with that person? Did I walk away feeling good initially and longer term? Did the other party walk away feeling good and longer term? Did we all benefit? So there are different measures about in the time lapse as well. It's not only what happens afterwards, but Rodney was saying something about the follow through. If people agree and they give away everything and you think, wow, that was easy, but nothing happens afterwards, or they, dig their heels and they say, well, we were just kind of kidding. We weren't really serious about that. Well, then you have to come back all over again. But now you have a bad attitude about it because now you don't trust the other party so much. So the implementation to me is just as important as the preparation. That carry through afterwards is equally important.
So that competency piece is really built into the coaching. I missed that part, right? It's all part of that coaching process, is evaluating competency and then enhancing skill set, and then evaluating and then enhancing skill set again. And Rodney, I think you might want to add something here. So I'll let you kind of tag on to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at somebody who's well seasoned as a negotiator, well trained, and they've got a lot of experience, Beth is a perfect example of that. The difference between somebody who has mastered the skill versus somebody who's new at it is really their ability, from my perspective, to move in and out of different orientations, meaning you don't have to use the same negotiation approach every single time. And I think one of the big challenges that we see in healthcare is that you've got these legacy, in some cases, supply chain folks or physicians, people that they have a very fixed sort of set bias as far as what negotiation is in their mind and how they approach it. And they don't deviate from that no matter what. It's always, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to push really hard for this. And that to me is one of the hallmarks of somebody who doesn't necessarily have a really good understanding of negotiation, because if that's your go-to every time, you're missing so many other opportunities. And really, it's the ability to move in and out of orientations, meaning when it's appropriate, I can be collaborative. When it's appropriate, I can be competitive. When it's appropriate, I can avoid. When it's appropriate, I can absolutely acquiesce. But it's having, and it goes back again to that preparation process. If you don't have the prep done properly, you're incapable of moving in and out of those orientations. And then the one other piece I think I would say that makes it really challenging in healthcare is that there's all sorts of asymmetrical information, meaning supply chain in a hospital, they only have so much information that they can compile and realize and understand. Same thing with the vendors, same thing with the physicians. So it's really understanding those perspectives from each of those parties and trying to bring all that information together. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we see even today.
Great perspective. And it kind of leads into the next dialogue as we're in these negotiations with teams or one-on-ones. And it's 2021. Have they been the same? What gaps are you still seeing across the negotiation plane? Is it consistent? Is it evolving? Is it changing? What are some of the things you see? And then also, what are some of the solutions to help move through that?
Yeah, it's interesting. In one of your other podcasts, you had a guest who talked about interoperability. And that's a huge issue right now, right? Being able to have multiple healthcare systems, bring those data points together and making sense of all the data. That's a big deal. And I think right now things are getting better, but they're not quite there yet. There's still many hospitals that have no ability to really take EMR, ERP data and see it together and understand it from the same vantage point. And that creates an issue. I think the other issue associated with that is, and I hate to go back to preparation, but a lot of this is based on preparation. If you at the baseline level are incapable of getting the data that you need in order to come up with the right strategy and to understand who your outliers are, to understand what the trends are, to understand what physicians using what and why. And if you spend all your time just trying to compile that data, how much time are you going to have to actually build out your strategies? And we see that all the time. So all this energy is spent focused on trying to compile information, make sense of it, and not enough is spent with the strategic planning, and then certainly rehearsal, final prep. And so I think that the systems need to be better integrated, and there has to be cleaner data, obviously, in order to help with that preparation process.
I'm going to add something here too. So that means that if you prepare well, then you're probably preparing a couple of different possible scenarios that could happen. And then you have to be very attentive during the negotiation to listen for where things are going, to listen to what's not being said, because that's a lot of information there. You think, well, they didn't say no and they didn't say yes. What are they not saying here? What am I not getting? So to be able to be adaptable and flexible in that moment, because then you can pivot. If you've planned a couple of different scenarios, if you go in with one scenario, that's the only thing you have. And then if you hit a wall, you're stuck. That's it. The second piece is the negotiation doesn't take place in isolation. It's part of a larger context and a larger system. So how much authority do you really have in that negotiation? How much decision-making power do you have? And who do you have to answer to? Because sometimes we get pressures from outside that limit our agility in the moment in the negotiation, because we know that at the end of the day, we have to go back and tell the boss or tell somebody else what we agreed to. And how many times did they say, you agreed to what? And then that doesn't work out so well.
Even though you thought that you agreed with them prior, that was the end goal. And then all of a sudden it's not the end goal.
Right. Totally. And, Beth, you made a really good point there. And I think about a entry-level sales to an executive-level sales, call it whatever you want, on the negotiation strategy is just coming in, you have this full agenda that you're going to talk about, and they don't see that this sales process has changed, morphed, pivoted, gone down a completely different road. And it comes right back to, I think we have the key indicator we keep hearing is preparation, having options. Having the options, I think you brought up, I think is a key point of this podcast too.
How hard is it to keep everybody on the team that's involved in the negotiations on the same page with that? Because you're asking them all to read and react, right? So I think of football immediately on that. Is you've got the quarterback who's leading the negotiation. They're looking at what the defense is doing. They're audibling at the line. But then all of a sudden, as soon as that ball is hiked, Everybody else has still got to read and react based on what they thought might be happening and the adjustments that they made, but it still may not, that play may not evolve exactly the way they expected it to. I feel like, the pass goes a little too high because they ran a shorter route than you expected. I could just see where, it's almost like a dance, and all of a sudden somebody over here is doing the two-step and somebody over here is doing the electric slide. And it's like, this is not at all what we talked about. How do you get everybody on the same page with that messaging, especially because they have to make judgment calls?
Well, you have to be a cohesive team. And that means you have to really like each other and respect each other. You have to listen to each other, and you have to defer to who has the knowledge, who has the skill set in that particular moment. And what happens is if you have other dynamics taking place, like let's say somebody on the team has a relationship with the vendor that you may not be aware of, and they promise them something, or there's something else going on and there's a power play happening, or somebody wants to be the star, the I thing, well, then you're going to ruin the dynamic. So you have to be together. And this is what's not always happening, because inside of a hospital system, when you have different healthcare workers, they're not coming together as a team because they're each sort of vying for their own department or their own role in the negotiation. And that means the third party vendor has an advantage because he or she knows where they can wedge in between.
And there's it's really interesting, Beth, that you say that, because, when you look at the vendor-physician relationship, the vendor is with a sales rep who, is with that physician several days during the week. However, when you look at the physician with either relationship with supply chain or administrators, they may not have a conversation or see those folks for 6 months to a year. So who's going to have the stronger relationship? It's a really weird dynamic out of the gate, because doctors are the individuals that are prescribing the medical devices. They implant them, so they are the customer, but the patient's the ultimate customer. Too often we see a doctor tell a sales rep, I'll never switch to another company. And then at the same time, supply chain is telling the sales rep, we're going to switch 100% of the business to your competitor if you don't give us the price point we want. Now, what do you think happens with trust in that situation? Doesn't work out so well.
No. Well, there's
that was Garry's favorite strategy, by the way.
You know what? I just walked in and it all worked out. I mean, I was clinically good. Oh my gosh.
That's all that mattered.
That's right. That's exactly right. But yeah, thanks, Justin. I appreciate that.
I thought I'd throw you off
Justin's a nurse too, so I can't make too much fun of him clinically. So, but I think there's change management here. We use that word so loosely, and it's defining it where it morphs, where it pivots, as we talked about. What are we doing in today's world as we move through this, the negotiation, conflict resolution? How are we addressing that? And maybe give us some key points, Beth, and Rodney sure appreciate it too.
Well, I will say that we just developed a new elective in it, because when there's change, and as a consultant, I've worked a lot with organizations on change. So it's not that people are against change as a concept, but when it comes to really changing their role or their situation, there's a lot of fear of the unknown, even though I've seen so many people complain when I do a needs assessment. So many people complain. You think they'd be happy to have the change, and then they fight it at every turn. I'm like, why are you fighting this if this is something you want? And the basic thing is that I know how to function now. I don't know what's going to be. What if my situation gets worse? Or what if I get the pink slip? What if I'm no longer needed? What if I become redundant? So there's so much fear of the unknown. And one of the worst things that leaders don't do in change management efforts is they do not communicate enough. It's so much better to communicate on a regular basis, even if you don't have an answer, just to say, we're aware of this, we're working on it, we'll get back to you, let us know. Just constant conversation and constant communication will alleviate so much of the fear.
And inclusivity too. Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd add to that, and we see this again, a lot of organizations, a lot of parallels where understanding incentives, right? If you want people to change, understand what the incentives are, the underlying driving force that's going to get them to change. Is it, if I'm a doctor, do I need a new piece of equipment? Do I prefer to stick with one vendor because my, case times are shorter? What is the incentive for them? And then how does that compare to an administrator? and even the vendor. And I think that can really reduce the barriers to change if it's done correctly.
So as we're wrapping up the interview, this one went really fast. As we're kind of wrapping up, what do you think needs to be done next to really advance skill sets and negotiations, to really talk about that competency, to help organizations, not just individuals, truly prepare, and especially around that communication component, because I can see that that's so critical to the preparation piece. Like, what can be done to help operationalize that, or what can be done to really embed that into a culture, an organizational culture, when it comes to working, between providers and suppliers towards a successful negotiation that really benefits the organization, the patient, and the supplier, so that there's harmony?
Well, in addition to preparation, which I'm not sure we emphasized enough on this call, right, is really talking about the bigger picture. What is the bigger picture and the goal strategically of the organization? And then how does everything fit into it? Which means all of the smaller negotiations have to fit into the bigger trajectory. So that needs to be communicated. And then people could practice doing their negotiations with each other, really support each other to get on the same page and really hone their skills and get feedback from their colleagues. And
Rodney, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think organizations have to prioritize it. I mean, there's a lot of hospitals that are taking on, your heart goes out to some of the folks that work in some of these hospitals, because they're dealing with so much, right? Especially with COVID right now and everything that's happened. But across the spectrum of any hospital, they deal with so many different vendors. They deal with so many situations. And, if the leadership at these organizations prioritize proper training, the results could be tremendous. It could be very low-hanging fruit for a lot of them, especially when it comes to physician engagement and alignment with supply chain.
Well, I'll say there's been a significant elevation of, I think it always used to get seen as materials management. And now it's strategic sourcing, right? Now it's value analysis. So there's all of that coming into play. And so developing this talent to take that higher, more strategic level approach. And I think the pandemic did a lot. I think it really said, hey, have we invested in these people the way that we should have in our organization? And I think it really shined a light that there's even more that we can do. And it's not just professional trade organizations that do a really great job as well, but it's organizational culture. It's, those teams training. It's that change management. It's formal education. I mean, really, and also just helping identify people with the right skill set to do these kinds of roles within healthcare. So I want to thank you both so much for coming on this show. I think it's a nice teaser, but I feel like we could talk about this in like 6 more episodes and break each piece down, in much more detail. But Beth, thank you so much for sharing your insights on the show today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it and had a lot of fun.
Appreciate both your input from both sides. It's almost like academia and knowledge and then medical device internal, and pulling those two together. I love it. I think it's really cool.
And Rodney, thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we got connected, and I hope we all stay in touch, because I think you're really onto something here, something very important for the growth of the healthcare industry, specifically in this supply chain world that is getting such a light shined on it right now. So thank you, Rodney.
Excellent.
That was Beth Fisher-Yoshida, CEO at Fisher-Yoshida International LLC, and Rodney Erb, CEO at TruVue Analytics. We're talking about negotiations, and really, Beth really, she was so funny. She's like, I think we talked a lot about preparation, but preparation is such a key in terms of that communication and the skill set to make sure that you keep everybody in alignment during negotiations. And that whole concept of read and react throughout negotiations can really make it very complex, especially as we've always kind of been aware of, Garry, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience, but that scenario where they use the clinician clinicians to kind of split against supply chain when they're doing contract negotiations, and, to kind of, break that communication down so that they get a real sense of where their leverage is. That is something that does happen, quite commonly. I think with the emergence of value analysis, it's helped to kind of alleviate that. But there was a time 20 plus years ago, as you know, Gary, where the clinicians were basically pitted against, purchasing and contracting and supply chain, against each other. And that really did work, to the advantage of one side of the negotiations.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the day, it was negotiation and training by VHS. They would train you as an organization and see how you did and go back and forth, and they were pitted against each other. And I think clinical to materials management, as it was called, it was a game of fetch. It was like chase the tennis ball, come back, chase the tennis ball, come back. There was no collaboration. And I think what both Beth and Rodney touched on is the evolution of it to where it is now with change management. They talked about some really good details during the podcast, and I think they're on the cutting edge of where we need to be moving forward. It's only going to keep evolving, and they're there. From an academia standpoint and from a, his experience too, Rodney being a, med device rep back in the day and his learnings as well. I think what a collaboration that was today.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Spotify, or search for Power Supply Media on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for certain episodes. You just got to download our smartphone app, and while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and review because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Garry and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.